Yeah, I think we are recording. Okay, so we will begin roughly around page 61 of the PDF, and we'll try and see how much ground we can cover today. So just to maybe begin with one very general remark about this trilogy and specifically this text, it has often been said that like Finnegan's Wake, this is also a text which has, or not just this text, the trilogy as a whole, is a set of novels that have kind of terminal aesthetics. Terminal aesthetics in the sense that it's very difficult to write anything on top of this, as if following on from this tradition. And I mean, this is a comment that has often been made about Finnegan's Wake for very different reasons, of course, because of primarily expansive reasons, the ambition of that very book to write what Joyce would call the history of the world in the form of the novel. Whereas, of course, in a more minimalist way, books like The Unnamable are very difficult to, write an afterlife for or afterlife of. So this question of terminal aesthetics is an interesting point. I mean, the American novelist John Barth, who's also one of the first sort of postmodern fiction writers, he wrote a very famous and influential essay in the 70s or 80s, I think. He wrote two essays, actually. The first one was called The Literature of Exhaustion. The second one was The Literature of Replenishment. So that's how he transitioned, or that's how he sort of discussed the transition from modernism to postmodernism. Modernism as a kind of self-exhausting form. And the examples included Beckett. Whereas, with postmodernism, he was thinking of, books like 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez and so on. He also mentioned Nabokov's Pale Fire as one of those sort of late modernist works, Text for Nothing and so on. So this idea of exhaustion, a text that exhausts itself, is, of course, very strongly present in The Unnamable, as we have already been saying, in terms of, the idea of exhausting speech, the idea of being exhausted by speech, being exhausted by the others that are very much located in the order of speech. Again, this would sound very Lacanian to many of you possibly, but we do have this independent formulation without going into psychoanalysis in The Unnamable itself. In fact, there are sentences that go, I am made in others' words. So this idea that the words have a life of their own and words generate others around us is verily present in the very text of The Unnamable. So I wanted to mention this terminal aesthetics question in the beginning and this idea of exhaustion. To go back to the thread and to sort of pick up on the second story, the second failed story. I suppose another way of thinking about this terminality is to think about the failure of storytelling. These are not novels that delineate storytelling. What they delineate is the failure of storytelling. As Beckett, famously said, younger Beckett said, to fail is the destiny of the artist. The artist has to fail, and failure is a good thing. So there's a certain, let's say, an aesthetics of failure that is often discussed in Beckett's studies. And again, we see that in The Unnamable. Another expression that he would often use, and that's something to note because we see that again all over The Unnamable, the expression that Beckett himself used is syntax of weakness. The kind of language he uses. In fact, this was a mild complaint he had with Kafka, even though he was a great admirer, that Kafka's language somehow does not represent the breakdown of his characters. So the complaint was the characters are all broken down, but the language is not in tatters. The language is very, very sort of, free-flowing and fluent and so on. That was a problem, according to Beckett. And in his own work, if we compare it with Kafka's, this is a marked difference. The breakdown of the subject is represented by the breakdown of language. And we have this, tortuous syntax of weakness, what we see in The Unnamable as well. Another thing that, of course, he does is, apart from killing off the narrative, the typical realistic narrative of a novel, he's also, as we can see, entirely, let's say, reducing the novel to a monologue. What we have is a monologue with all these complex kinds of ventriloquization. But it is a monologue at the end of the day. There is no direct speech in The Unnamable. There is absolutely no dialogue, which is strange in a novel. Of course, a novel, as you know, in the larger sense of the term dialogue, has often been considered a dialogic form of multiple voices in the famous sort of Bakhtinian model of the novel. Uh, I'm not saying the Bakhtinian novel doesn't quite work in The Unnamable. One could think of that idea of plurivocality, multiple voices, and a sort of open-ended dialogue of multiple voices, the way Bakhtin would talk about Dostoevsky's form of the novel, Dostoevskian novel, let's say. Anyway, I mean, let's come back to the text and just go through with the second story. So what we would see here is, some sort of a development from the first story to the second story. The second story is about the Unnamable, or again, it's one of those stories by Mahmoud. So we don't know whether the figure in the story is actually the Unnamable, but that's what it is, proposed, that it's a story of the Unnamable. And this story has some continuities with the first one, because the first one was primarily about this sort of violence of being put inside a family, being artificially put inside a family, and how that led to the death of the entire family, as it were. So the thread of the family is somewhat continuing in this second story, which has more color, which has more detail, in fact, a more specific setting as well. The story is about the Unnamable's relation, let us call it that, with a woman who is sometimes called Madeleine, who's sometimes called by another name, as we will see. And it's about the Unnamable as this little, worm-like figure in a jar. And he's presented almost like a little object to entice customers right outside this restaurant. And the woman who owns this restaurant, this slaughterhouse, which is called a slaughterhouse as well, this meat shop essentially, and a restaurant at the same time. There are many places like that, especially in Paris, where you have a meat shop and a restaurant which basically function together. So we have this woman who looks after her. The relationship between the Unnamable and this woman is complicated because on the one hand, there's some sort of a maternal affection, maternal care, and that's the connection with the first story. But on the other hand, there's also this, objectification, commoditization, whatever you want to call it. It's commoditization in the sense that quite literally, the woman is using the Unnamable as an object, as a commodity, to entice people into the shop. It's like outside MacD, sometimes you see, these days we mostly see the sort of, the statuette of the clown. You've seen this outside other restaurants. And I remember a long time back, maybe just outside Scoop in the Dharmatala area, I remember there was actually a human being who was dressed up as a clown trying to entice little kids to go into Scoop, or was it some other restaurant? I can't exactly remember, but it's very common. We see actual human beings playing that role where they're practically reduced to an object. People would come, take photographs with them, sit with them on the bench outside the restaurant and things like that. The Unnamable is a freak object, not quite a human being. Seems like it is also minuscule because it's inside this jar and she keeps changing the sawdust and, covers it with tarpaulin when it's snowing, when it's cold. So there is this sort of care relationship or an affection, a relationship of affection, but it's again mediated by the market, as it were, mediated by the commodity fetishism or the commodity function of the market. Again, it as I said, continues that familial trope towards the end of this story, which is intermittently presented. Anyway, we are not sure whether it's a mother or even a beloved for that matter. The two names are Madeleine and Marguerite, before I forget. So let me just quickly go over a little prelude before we go on to that story. I told you the basics of the story so that you're on top of it when we come to this. Just give me a second. Right. So the story kind of starts at the end of page 61. And it's interesting that there's a sort of interesting political interlude here where the Unnamable says, this is at the fag end of page 61, and I'm reading, they know I'm speechless and consequently incapable of taking unfair advantage of my situation to stir up the population against its governors by means of burning oratory during the rush hour or subversive slogans whispered after nightfall to belated pedestrians the worse for drink. So again, you have this sort of admission of weakness, admission of incapacity. But having said that, this would again remind us of the encounters with the cops that Molloy had. So there's this vagrant politics, let us say, in Beckett, which is often quite interesting. You would very rarely see a full-blown bourgeois character in Beckett. And this is a major difference. If you think of the majority, at least, of Joyce's characters, they are all middle-class bourgeois characters. Beckett is not interested in portraying those characters. More often than not, he would be talking about tramps and clowns and homeless people, vagrant people, and so on. So in the lines that I just read out, on the one hand, there is this weakness of the homeless subject. He cannot really stir up the population. He's also disabled. He's not physically capable. But at the same time, there remains, as we know, the state is always deeply suspicious of vagrant people because they think one of them can stir up something, precisely this idea of stirring up the population against its governors. So there's a slightly mocking, but nevertheless interesting, political commentary here, which is there, in fact, in a way throughout. There are various references and jokes around the idea of sexual impotency. And again, this is very common in Beckett. The Beckettian male subject is not a hypermasculine, virile subject. In fact, it's a subject which is deeply insecure. And it's also a masculine subject that is always admitting its, let's say, phallic failure, the failure of the phallus, right? And this is something that we see throughout, the fact that there is sawdust between his legs, the fact that the virile member, so to speak, is not capable of anything anymore. These kinds of, jokes are there throughout, jokes where the Unnamable is kind of laughing at himself, as it were. And that's why I keep saying himself, even though the gender of the Unnamable remains a little bit of a mystery. Right. Again, the skullscape is mentioned on page 62. We kind of go into the story already. As I say, the jar is mentioned towards the end of page 61, just before that section. Stuck like a sheaf of flowers in a deep jar. This is page 61. Its neck flush with my mouth on the side of a quiet street near the shambles. I'm at rest at last. So that's the position of the Unnamable in that jar. Before this, it was suddenly said that he's in some sort of an island, and then he comes again in Mahood's story in this jar, this worm-like creature, and the name worm will soon become functional. On page 62, we have that reference to the tarpaulin. As I was saying, yes, it was fatal. No sooner had the tarpaulin settled over me and the precipitate steps of my benefactress died away than the tears began to flow. Was this to be interpreted as an effect of gratitude? But in that case, should not I have felt grateful? Besides, I realized darkly that if she took care of me thus, it was not solely out of goodness, or else I had not rightly understood the meaning of goodness when it was explained to me. It must not be forgotten that I represented for this woman an undeniable asset. This is 62-63 I'm reading from. For quite apart from the services I rendered to her lettuce, I constituted for her establishment a kind of landmark, not to say an advertisement, far more effective than, for example, a chef in cardboard, a pot-bellied in profile and full-face wafer thin. So this is the commodity point that I was making there. So she had taken to festoon the jar with Chinese lanterns, which were very pretty and all of that. The menu was kept right beside the Unnamable so that whenever anyone wants to pick up the menu, they would see the Unnamable, and this freakish little object will, entertain them into perhaps, and cajole them into the restaurant. So that's the idea. All right, let me just go through with this and see. What we see is, again, the story dwindling, withdrawing itself, and then coming back later on. This is something that we see with the second story. In fact, let me read a little section from page 64. The story is no good. This story is no good. I'm beginning almost to believe it. That's why the story is no good, right? Because these are all stories the Unnamable is deeply suspecting. If he's beginning to believe in one of these stories, that's actually a problem. Then the resistance stops. But let us see how it is supposed to end. That will sober me. The trouble is, I forget how it goes on. But did I ever know? Perhaps it stops there. Perhaps they stopped it there, saying, who knows? There you are now. You don't need us anymore. This, in fact, is one of their favorite devices, to stop suddenly at the least sign of addition from me. Addition here refers to identification. The moment he starts faintly to identify with the story, with the subject in the story, they will stop the story. I'm going back to reading. Leaving me high and dry with nothing for my renewal, but the life they have imputed to me. And it is only when they see me stranded that they take up again the thread of my misfortunes, judging me still insufficiently vitalized to bring them to a successful conclusion alone. This is the important point now. But instead of making the junction, I've often noticed this, instead of resuming me at the point where I was left off, they pick me up at a much later stage. Right? So that's one of the major problems here, that they drop his story at a certain point, and they pick up from a different point, from a later point. And that becomes difficult for the Unnamable to digest or follow. What do they want to do? And again, he speculates, perhaps thereby hoping to induce in me the illusion that I had got through the interval on my own, lived without help of any kind for quite some time, and with no recollection of by what seems or in what circumstances, or even died all on my own, and come back to earth again by way of the vagina, like a real live baby, and reached a ripe age and even senility without the least assistance from them, and thanks solely to the hints they had given me. So the very complicated idea of freedom that you get here is that even your freedoms are dictated by these others, and let's call them political masters or political others. To what extent will you enjoy your freedom is again something that is programmed in you by these others. So this is again the problem of freedom. As I was saying, I think maybe I don't know whether I mentioned this earlier, but if freedom itself is controlled and dictated and decided by the other, is it freedom at all? We go back to the title of Beckett's first play, Eleutheria, which means freedom in Greek. There's one point that kind of recurs throughout many of these sections. As I said, the Unnamable is not always in a position to feel emotions, feel affect. One of the ways in which this novel subverts the religious trope, I think, is how we have a sort of a denial of suffering. Suffering, as you know, is the great Christian virtue, right? Christ suffers, not for himself, for all humanity. And that's the important point. He's representatively suffering for all humanity. It's a selfless, great suffering. Now, the masters in this book want the Unnamable to suffer, But as the Unnamable has said, even his tears are not tears of joy or sorrow because he doesn't feel those emotions. They're mechanical. Similarly, if at all he has any registration of suffering, that is completely mechanical. There is no greatness attached to this suffering. And suffering, of course, as I said, is one of those grand narrative of Christianity, at least. So again, there's a sort of a trivialization of that narrative of suffering because the Unnamable cannot be made to suffer. Even though he's being tortured by these masters and their stories, he does not register something as complex as suffering at the level of feeling. He does not feel any kind of suffering. Suffering is a feeling, right? So the other name that crops up here is warm. Again, a little bit of a pun on warm as WARM because the warm place is also mentioned soon before, just before the character of warm is introduced. So as I said, there is no self without the other in this book. And the others, constitute people like Basil, Mahood. Warm is sandwiched in between. So in order to, make a worm, you need a Basil and a Mahood. So again, that master-slave dialectic. But we see how reversible this dialectic is because there are moments when the Unnamable is made to become Mahood, and then it's like pupil Mahood. Mahood is referred or referenced as a student, as a pupil. So the master becomes the student. And, does the student become the master? That's a question. But we have these, reversible positions. Okay. Again, this idea of the eyes and the ears, as I said, they will become very important, but they are linked to two ideas of surveillance. The eye, again, is, of course, visual optic surveillance, cameras and so on. And the ear represents, again, the ear of the other. As we say in Hindi, "Diwaron ke bhi kaan hote hain." So it's that sort of, ear of the other. This is also a title of one of Derrida's works. Anyway, we'll come to that point about the visual and auditory and how the auditory kind of, starts to dominate halfway through the novel a little bit. The story gets completely diverted back into the monologue. It loses itself until it comes back at a later point. We'll see that, how the story comes back. Meanwhile, around pages 65, 66, again, there are all these references to the sort of, again, decapacitated flesh of the Unnamable. There are various animals that are mentioned here, specifically the horse. The horse has a sort of important function here. We'll come back to this, but just outside that restaurant where the Unnamable was kept in the jar, there was a particular statue of the apostle on the horse. And the horse reference has often been linked with Swift's, Gulliver's Travels, especially the last book that contains these weird humanoids or horse-like creatures, the houyhnhnms, right? The name Gulliver is not mentioned, but in Malone Dies, we have a character called Lemuel, which again, of course, would remind you of Gulliver's Travels and Gulliver. So sometimes these Swiftian connections have been made. If we look at Beckett's early short fiction, the three stories that he wrote, First Love, The End, and The Carminative, again, the gaze of the horse is often mentioned. As I was saying, there's a reference to this equine eye. It comes a little bit later, around page 85, 86, I think. The equine eye is again the eye of the horse. Now, in all these stories, we see this very odd, awkward kind of an encounter between the human subject and the animal which is always gazing, almost staring at the human subject, and uncomfortable that gaze is for the human being. This is again something that we can't possibly go very deep into, but we always have that sort of complicated encounter between the human and the animal in Beckett, not in a very anthropocentric way, but it is, let's say, an encounter of discomfiture. It's not a very nice encounter. Sometimes it's enigmatic, sometimes it's straight out uncomfortable. But the gaze of the animal is a little bit disturbing for the human. That is a consistent take. We see this in another short text called From an Abundant Work, where again the horse becomes an important point of reference. Of course, by the time Beckett writes this, as we know, he has been in psychotherapy, he has read a lot of psychoanalytic literature, and he's aware of the case study of Little Hans, for example, which has something to do with horses. So again, I mean, there are possible shadows here of various psychoanalytic vignettes that he might have been aware of, but it's difficult to sort of make a very hard evidenced claim about those things. Anyway, we might come back to this. So the Clydesdale is the horse which is mentioned on page 66, which is a Suffolk stallion. Right. Let me just continue and see if there's anything more I wanted to say about this section. Again, I mean, this resistance, as I was saying, is there all throughout. I mean, I have many problems, but changing my tune is not one. On page 68. So again, I mean, this consistency of resisting all these ideologies, all these grand fictions of the self. I mean, at another level, we could also say that this critique of humanist education that we are looking at is also a critique of all the identity discourses. The great fictions of the self are all identity discourses. I mean, nationalism is an identity discourse. Ethnocentrism is an identity discourse. Gender, in a very codified sense, is also an identity discourse, if you think of it in terms of binary, heteronormativity and so on. So all these are identity discourse. Caste is an identity discourse. Class is an identity discourse. So, if we think of it like that, the novel also has this implication throughout how identity discourses are reductive by nature. And perhaps one has to retain some element of distance from each of these identity discourses, which is not to say you will not have an identification. Again, if I put this in a sort of psychoanalytic language, it would be identification without identities. Identification without identities. There might be moments when I identify with my ethnicity. There might be moments when I identify with my nationality. But does that mean my ethnicity sums me up, or my nationality sums me up, or gender sums me up? That's where the problem lies. So if the identity discourses become reductive, or if one's identity is entirely reduced to one of these things, or all of these things, that's a problem. Identity discourses are fine as long as you are aware that you are not just this nationality, this ethnicity, this gender, this sexual orientation, and so on and so forth. Because all these things are anyway mobile. Many of these things are, in fact, most of these things are accidentalist, right? You're not necessarily born because you want to be born into a particular nationality, ethnicity, class, caste, and so on, gender, and so on. Anyway, I mean, let's not go into a very detailed sociological discussion of that, but I just wanted to flag that point that, these ideologies that are potentially dictatorial, like religion, like education itself, could also be seen as identitarian ideologies, identitarian discourses. Again, I mean, Malone and others are mentioned. Just going to continue. Yeah, so as I was saying, this reference to the pupil Mahood, that's on page 70. And again, what we have is a sort of a satire on education quite clearly. Let me read this part. Pupil Mahood, for the 25,000th time, what is a mammal? And I'll fall down dead, worn out by the rudiments, but I'll have made my progress. I'll have made progress, sorry. They told me so, only not enough, not enough. What was I? In my lessons, where was I? That is what has had a fatal effect on my development, my lack of memory. So again, we go back to that Platonic thread, lack of memory, everything being washed clean. No doubt about it. Pupil Mahmood, repeat after me, man is a higher mammal. So again, you see how he's making fun of this species hierarchy, the so-called great chain of being, as Renaissance would sort of, frame it, or Renaissance philosophy would like to frame it in certain ways. So it's making fun of this humanist education model. This is also a critique of that species humanism. I couldn't, the Unnamable says. Always talking about mammals in this menagerie. Frankly, between ourselves, what the hell could it matter to people Mahood? The man was this rather than that. Presumably nothing has been lost in any case, since here it all comes slobbering out again, let loose by the nightmare. So this again, this anti-humanism or this critique of humanism continues. In fact, the expression that, let me just try and find that, the blessed pus of reason. This is an expression that occurs much later on page 83. We will come to that. But this, page 83. But this idea that, reason is like a pus in the body is an important idea in Beckett. I mean, he is clearly an anti-rationalist. He's not an absurdist, but he's an anti-rationalist. That much we can say. And this is that kind of anti-rationalism at work when it comes to this idea of the conceptualization of the human body as something that is going to be wounded by reason. Reason is like poison in the human body. It's like a pus, the blessed pus of reason. And it's rationality that these educators are trying to instill in the Unnamable. But as I said, the Unnamable's mode of resistance is something that lies in his stupidity. The fact that he won't learn, and that's the advantage that he has in this case. Right. Let me just continue here. Right. So again, we go back to the story more or less around page 72, 73. Again, there's a reference to the lady and the whole, situation that we had earlier visited. The situation, the Unnamable is like this little object in the jar. And here we have the name Marguerite. Suddenly, the name was Madeleine. So again, we have these accidental shifts of the name that we discussed earlier. Names are arbitrary. If we believe in that nominalist idea, rather than a realist notion, we could say that names are just accidental linguistic entities. They don't really necessarily connote or have any intrinsic relation with the human being. Anyway, the name is a mark of the other, again, to use a sort of basic psychoanalytic understanding. Not just psychoanalytic, also sociological at some level. You're always named by another person. You're named by a family member, usually a parent or a grandparent. Someone names you, but yourself. So the name is always alienating because you are caught into a certain kind of prism of the name. The name usually connotes a whole series of, expectations that usually the parents or the family has from us, and that's why we are named the way we are named, right? So anyway, the arbitrariness of the name is what I wanted to note here. Soon Marguerite will come. This is page 73, and light me up. She's late. Already more than one passerby has flashed his lighter under my nose, the better to decipher what I shall now describe by way of elegant variation as the bill of fare. Please God, nothing has happened to my protectress. So he's worried about her. I shall not hear her coming. I shall not hear her steps because of the snow. I spent all morning under my cover. When the first frosts come, she makes me a nest of rags, well tucked in all round me, to preserve me from chills. It's snug. I wonder, will she powder my skull this evening? I mean, to make a quick biographical note, when Beckett is translating this into English, his mother, May Beckett, has just passed away. In fact, there's this very interesting kind of detail about his psychotherapy. Of course, psychotherapy is a place where parents often come out on the couch, and they may not come out in the most favorable lights, you know. We have in case of Beckett is that, and there's a little bit of this in Baudelaire as well. Baudelaire's mother, by the way, had a legal pact that that Baudelaire cannot spend beyond a certain amount. He was so wasted that his mother wanted to make sure he doesn't go out of control. Anyway, with Beckett, the funny detail is, as Beckett himself noted, this entire operation of psychotherapy became almost an exorcism of the mother. The mother's voice needed to be exorcised. May Beckett was a very strong mother. And as Beckett said at one point, this is noted in James Nolson's biography, I am what your savage loving has made me, he said. Not to his mother, but thinking about his mother. So he called it a kind of savage love. It was a very complicated relationship, as almost all mother-child relationships are. So, but the funny thing is, his mother, and this is the Baudelairean connection, his mother was funding that psychoanalytic psychotherapy, which actually was an exorcism of the mother. So, and Beckett notes this in one of the letters that, I keep saying horrible things about her, but she's funding this whole therapy because Beckett at that point was not financially independent enough. Anyway, so I just wanted to make that quick point about this very sardonic, but a very, complicated relationship with the mother figure we see in this book here. Marguerite, Madeleine. There's a part of the Unnamable that has clearly some feelings for this woman. There's another part of the Unnamable which likes to think that, it's just this commodity relationship. But what makes us think at some level is the function of commodity, even in maternal-paternal relationships. Because typically we like to think that the relationship we have with our family members is not mediated by the market. It's not mediated by capitalism. It's not mediated by this whole, use value, exchange value thing that Marx talks about. But is a question. And that's kind of thrown open by the Unnamable. There's some beautiful passages here about the sky as a kind of slate pencil. I won't go into all of that because it'll take us into different directions and we don't really have the time. There's also a hilarious passage about a doctor. It's a digression. Mahood apparently once knew a doctor who actually thought people breathed through their arses and not through their mouths. And it's the arse that has to be shown in the mirror. That's again a very typical Beckettian humor about the arse. There's a comic ode to the arse in Molloy. And there are, Molloy is also a fart counter, someone who counts his farts. And sometimes he farts into the Times literary supplement, which you can understand again has a sort of very typical Swiftian political satire writ into it. Anyway, so much about farts and asses. Okay, so where does this story come to an end? Again, it does not come to an end. As I said, all these stories fail because the subject is never able to identify with any of these stories, right? These stories fail because they don't go anywhere, yes, but they also fail because they don't come from the subject. The subject never owns them up. There's no ownership of these stories, and that's the problem. There's a decision not to use the first person anymore on page 75, and after this you will see the I, there's still some I, but very soon it will become a he. The I would become a he. The story about Madeleine or Marguerite has come to an end, by the way. We don't know where it ended, how it ended. Certainly did not end with her death or with his death, but she didn't come one day or one evening, and that's basically the last we heard. There's also this moment where, just give me a second, where the Unnamable thinks that, considers what kind of place she might have in in his life and what kind of place he might have in her life. Like, for example, this is page 75. She loves me. I've always felt it. She needs me. Her chop house, her husband, her children, if she has any, are not enough. There is in her a void that I alone can fill. So this is again very amorous, right? I mean, the what we can see here is a very, as I said, I mean, it's a commodity relationship. It's also a maternal relationship. At one level, it's perhaps also a hyper-Oedipal kind of a love relationship. There is in her a void that I alone can fill, which is not just a carnal reference. This again, goes very strikingly hand in hand with psychoanalytic ideas of love, where the idea is when one person falls in love with another person, they are constituting each other's lack. It's the lack in one person that is speaking to another lack in the other person. And love is thus a dialogue of these two lacks. What we lack is something that we notice in the other, and we fall in love with that lack. The lack that is my lack, but also something that resonates with my lack in the other. So again, we have this sort of quasi-psychoanalytic understandings of love here, as it were. And again, it's mentioned here. Who is this woman? The near relation. So there was a time I thought she was perhaps a near relation, mother, sister, daughter, or such like, perhaps even a wife, and that she was sequestrating me. That is to say, Mahood, seeing how little impressed I was by his chief witness, whispered this suggestion in my ear, adding, I didn't say anything. I must admit, it is not so preposterous as it looks at first sight. And it goes on like that. But you understand how, this woman could become any of the, caregivers, any of the familial others. And these were the figures who were all mentioned in the first story. These were the figures who died by sausage poisoning anyway. Right, let's just move on a little bit. Let me see if I can come to another particular point. This is page 77. And this is where I was mentioning Arnold Rulings last time. Worm is mentioned. Worm, as I said, is sandwiched between Basil and Mahmoud as a figure who might represent the unnamable. Again, part of all this gang of others. There's an interesting reference here. This is at the end of page 77. Feeling nothing, knowing nothing, he exists. So this he is now the alternative for the I. The I has been replaced with a he, with a third person marker. He exists nevertheless, but not for himself, for others. Others conceive him and say, worm is, since we conceive him as if there could be no being but being conceived, if only by the beer. Beer, of course, does not mean the alcohol here. Beer is a particular coinage that Beckett does. It's a neologism. And so the one who is the beer, the B from B to beer, B-double-E-R, okay? But this particular sentence, as if there could be no being but being conceived, this comes almost straight out of his sort of general interest in another Irish philosopher, Bishop Berkeley. By the way, Bishop was, not Bishop, sorry, Berkeley was Beckett's middle name, Samuel Berkeley Beckett. Anyway, he was interested in Bishop Berkeley's philosophy, and especially that famous coda from Berkeley, to be is to be perceived. Isi ist percipii, to be is to be perceived. This became the tagline or the coda of his film, the film script that he wrote and quasi-directed, even though it was directed by Alan Schneider, his American director, and this was his only trip to America when he filmed it with the great Buster Keaton, by the way. This film is very important in film history because it marks the last appearance of the great Buster Keaton. Initially wanted Chaplin to play this role. Chaplin didn't have time, so Buster Keaton came along. Anyway, so if we see the coda of film, it says to be is to be perceived, which of course has a very cinematic meaning in that text. But anyway, this idea that to be is also to be conceived by the other, and without the other, there is no being. Without the beer, there's no being. A beer lover would like it anyway. Others, one alone, then others, one alone turn towards the all important, the all impotent, all nescient that haunts him. Then others, towards him, whom he would nourish, he, the famished one, and who, having nothing human, has nothing else, has nothing, is nothing. So this sentence, as I said, if you think about all impotent and then all nescient, this would remind us of the Hewlingian idea of nesico, the self that does not know everything. So Hewlings was, of course, Cartesian, but he was also depleting the Cartesian idea of that point of certainty. I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, being the point of certainty. He was negating that idea of certainty, Hewlings. And hence that famous ethical dictum, where you're worth nothing, there you should want nothing. Now, that is very close to the end of this sentence, if you notice. Has nothing, is nothing. I don't have anything, there's no having, there's no being either. I am nothing. I have nothing, I am nothing. So again, that locution, the very phrasing of the sentence would remind us of Hewlings, as well as that word nescient, all impotent, the fact that I don't know. I think I mentioned this earlier, but let's quickly revisit that idea. The problem of God, I think I made some very brief remarks about this last time, but this idea of the problem of God being not just a theological question, but a general philosophical question, it comes back to this point when we are talking to ourselves or when we are talking to another person, who are we addressing? Are we always addressing the person who's there talking to us? Are we addressing ourselves? So God, at a very logical level, and this is a very, of course, a Levinasian point, that God is the other of the other, the extreme other, the altogether other. And this is why someone like Levinas thought God is a problem in philosophy, not just in theology, but even in so-called secular philosophy. Secular philosophy too has to think through the question of God, because the moment there is a self, there is an other. And whenever there is an other, we think of the other of the other. But is there an other of the other? The classic figure for the other of the other is God. And that's where, we typically stop with that triad: self, other, other of the other, right? Anyway, we can come to this later. I want to move on a little bit further, but I just wanted to make some more clarification about this comment I had made last time. And we do see that particular, let's say, secular problematic of the God as a logical function of speech. God as a logical extension or a logical function of speech as the addressee, the anonymous addressee of all speech, including self-directed speech. And a believer would like to think so, right? That's the whole idea of the prayer, if you think about it. A prayer is a self-directed speech which is addressed to God, right? Anyway, we can move on a little bit. So the idea of the ventriloquist appears on page 79, but it's a clumsy act of ventriloquism where you can actually see the ventriloquist. So it's like if you see the puppeteer, the puppet show loses its charm, but it's also a very Brechtian moment where you see the inner workings of theater that make the theater happen and that are usually hidden. Eden, not hidden. Eden is mentioned, the Garden of Eden, very briefly. This whole religious veneer continues. But as I say, it's not much more than a veneer. It's not much more than mythology that Beckett uses throughout. Sort of a bagatelle. Again, there are various games that are mentioned throughout the book. Bagatelle is one of them on page 80, which is mentioned. This whole thing is like a bagatelle with the self and the other. The dialectic itself is a bagatelle. The question of the voice is quite explicitly mentioned from around page 80, and it goes on. Voice is also an auditory phenomenon, right? So voice goes hand in hand with the emphasis on the ear and the emphasis on hearing. Are these people dead? Basil, Mahmoud, and the other figures, Malloy, Malone, Moran, and so on. Are they unborn? Is Worm yet to be born? You know, these questions come back on page 82. The year again is mentioned on the same page, page 82. This idea of reason as an abscess, as I was saying, you know, some sort of abscess that one day on my windpipe or some other section of the conduit, this is page 83, a nice little abscess will form with an idea inside, point of departure for a general infection. This would enable me to jubilate like a normal person, knowing why? And in no time, I'd be a network of fistula bubbling with the blessed pus of reason. This is the expression I was using. So the fact that when you ideate in your mind, when a new idea is born, if you think of that idea as a kind of infection, as a virological infection, and if you think of that as an abscess, you know, this is a sort of negative characterization of reason, of course, and going back to that idea of the failure of a rational model of education. Let me just move on a little bit. I'm aware of time. I'll finish soon, but let me see if I can say something more about the next 4 or 5 pages that I wanted to mention, that I wanted to sort of cover at least. We might have to go a little bit faster tomorrow because I wanted to make a little more progress than what we've been able to make. Right. I mean, this idea of suffering comes out on 85, on page 85. Who is suffering? Is he actually suffering? If he's uncomprehending the entire torture, is it then a torture? Is it actually a kind of suffering? That question comes back, as I said. Okay. The color gray again is mentioned, which was mentioned about, and then it was kind of again negated by the black, but the color comes back again on 88. What is this place? It's like a hole. Is it like a hole in the earth? I mean, this is again mentioned earlier. There's a strange obsession with depth, and the text itself emphasizes that. Why do we need to think when we are in this sort of unknown place, that we are deep down somewhere, inside somebody's head, inside somebody's belly, inside the belly of the earth? Why do we need to think of any secret place as a kind of depth? What about a secret surface? Again, if you think about the purloined letter, that's exactly what the minister plays upon. The minister hides the letter on the surface, and the cops go all into the depths to find it, but they don't find it because it's not in some depth. A surface could also be a secret. You could, sort of, encrypt something even on the surface. I think I'm almost about to end. Let me just see if there's one last point. Yeah, and we can stop here around page 91. I'll pick it up from here next time. But yeah, questions, please. Yes, Hiranmay, I can see. Is there anyone else? There's a question. Hiranmay, you can start. Yeah, Hiranmay, please go ahead. You can ask your question. I can see your hand, but okay. I think you have written the question. Okay, is worm a Leibnizian monad? It's a good question because again, there are references to windowlessness, and so on. I suppose one thing that we have to be a little bit careful about when it comes to any kind of theoretical encounters with a text is not to, sort of completely straitjacket the text in a theory or with a theory. Of course, we could, I think a more fruitful way of doing any kind of theoretical reading is to try and read the theory and the text independently and see where they encounter each other, maybe along a shared axis of ideas. So rather than saying, worm is a windowless monad or a Leibnizian monad, one could possibly think of what that comparison could bring in. For example, this whole idea of windowlessness of the monad goes back to some sort of an idea of self-encapsulation, where there is no, exteriority, as it were. One of the problems with that is that there is a lot of exteriority in the unnamable. All these others are there. And again, to go back to one of the points that you had mentioned earlier, we never quite know whether these others are inside his head, inside the unnamable, or outside. Because there is no distinction between inside and outside. What is outside is inside, and what is inside is outside. So yeah, there are definitely similarities here. And if we go back to Beckett's philosophy notes, he did know his Leibniz pretty well. He was also kind of interested in the sort of mathematical patterning of Leibniz's work. I mean, Leibniz is also a mathematician at one level. Anyway, so I'll stop there, but I think, yeah, that's an interesting question. It's just that we have to think of them, think of all influences or possible comparisons with philosophy in a fairly discrete manner without entirely collapsing the text into, one of these theories. Anything else that anyone else wanted to ask, mention? Okay, so in that case, maybe we can stop here now. And tomorrow we will finish the text, which looks a little bit daunting, but we'll be able to do that, I think. I mean, it's just a matter of going a little bit faster, which I will do. Okay, so I'll stop.